Okay, so it's analysis time. And disc 1 ended with pretty much the most famous moment in the whole game, so really we're going to need to take a proper look at that first. There is no bigger spoiler in the whole history of video games than Iris dies. You'd be hard pressed to find a single gamer who doesn't know about it. It's the closest thing gaming has to a Luke I am your father moment. And despite how well known it is, it's no less effective because of that. It isn't the first major character death in an RPG, nor is it even the first in a Final Fantasy game. But it's not only the ubiquity of the game that makes it stick out, it's how masterful the scene actually is. It's not just all CGI cutscenes, there's a lot of different gameplay elements to it. In the build-up as Cloud draws his sword, you have to press the buttons to raise and swing. You can press other buttons too to try and stop Cloud, but nothing progresses until you actually press action. Suddenly Sephiroth isn't just controlling Cloud, he's controlling you. It's a worrying moment already, really, doing something you don't want to do, turning gameplay on its head. A lot of games do that these days and get praised for it, but FF7 shows that it's not exactly anything new. The moment itself also sticks out. Think of what usually happens with a death in video games. The cinematic qualities, the long drawn out speeches, the final breath goodbyes and epic no's. There's none of any of that here. The most famous death of all is just so sudden. Iris is alive 1 second and dead the next. The one attempt at actually making a grand speech is shut down totally by the emotions of having a whole person suddenly just ripped out from your life in an instant. The only dialogue in the whole scene is between Cloud and Sephiroth, and considering what we know, that almost seems like a battle of the inner self. And with that music, no dialogue's really needed. It's a pretty ballsy moment to then, with that emotion still there, throw in a boss battle. The game's set up to try and ensure you don't fail it, so long as you equip the water when you get in the forest beforehand, there ain't no chance of losing. It's almost like the game wants to provide a punching bag for your own emotions, perhaps. The usual boss theme doesn't even play either, it's still that sad music. Again, it's gameplay and story mixing together, releasing the anger of the characters. But the most powerful moment of all, really, is the aftermath. I talked previously about FF7 using animations instead of words a lot of the time, and this is the pinnacle of that. There are no words here. This is a scene that almost couldn't be done today. There'd have to be words, there'd have to be a speech, it'd have to be half an hour long. But no, it's all just stripped out. The reactions feel so genuine. Yuffie in particular has a reaction that basically gets me every time. And it continues on to the final CG cutscene, with Cloud laying Iris to rest. It's just so final. The loss of Iris isn't meant to be just patched up. There's always going to be that big hole where she was, and it's not going to be fixed anytime soon. Perhaps your own reaction could depend on how much you've actually used Iris up to this point, but seeing as she's a constant in my party, yeah. The first time I played through this game, I was fortunate enough to actually not have this spoiled for me, despite the details being everywhere basically from the get-go. But if anything, for me, the emotional impact of this scene is even greater now. You could call it a cliche, but there's honestly no scene that's quite like this one in video games. Iris's death is on its own. Crucially perhaps, it's a scene that could have only occurred how it did, with the impact it had, in the context of a video game. This is video game storytelling, whatever that may mean, at its peak, and quite frankly it's not been topped since. Still, that's not all there is to Disc 1. We kinda have to look at the rest of it too and provide thoughts and such. Actually, I have to be honest and say that the rest of Disc 1 is, well, a little patchy. It's certainly the slowest part of the game, which is kind of a relief after Midgar, but does it perhaps go on for a little too long? We spend most of the time exploring our secondary characters, basically. By the time we get to Barrett, he's kind of become a supporting player, and his story's not that interesting to begin with. Red 13's is better, but it's still a diversion. Oh, and you can also do Yuffie's side story as well, but I've saved that for another time. And of course, there's still a couple more characters to introduce over the disc, and they all need time to establish themselves as well. So the plot itself doesn't actually move all that much. We're always searching for Sephiroth, and he's always ahead of us. It's still good, but it's a definite slow burn. But of course, this doesn't last. When we get to Disc 2, the plot's going to seriously start moving forward, and when we finally do get plot at the end of Disc 1, it's worth waiting for. The game basically gradually sinks its hooks into you here, and then right at the end of the disc, it pulls the shit out of them. In the end, disc 1 does get away with it. Even if there's not a great deal of plot advancement, it sets everything up nicely with constant allusions and questions. You still get a lot of Cloud's weirdness, but it's then followed up with Tifa behaving oddly too. You also get the constant references to black materia, the Temple of the Ancients and whatnot, and particularly after Nibelheim you get the reunion and the clones milling about everywhere, which for me is one of the creepier parts of the whole game. The stream of side stories do a neat job of taking you away from all these subtle hints, so the story can set up a big payoff. And, well, we're just getting started on that. One funny thing, really, is that Aeris's death, perhaps the most well-known and most spoiled event in any RPG, isn't even the biggest revelation in the whole game. We're just getting started. Disc 1's slow build is almost like putting off the inevitable, leaving you in limbo and refusing to pull the curtain back and show you just how screwed up things truly are. It works even better on a second playthrough, where you can pick out all the hints much more clearly and see that, well, quite frankly, things were kinda screwed up from the beginning, and that you never really had even the faintest whiff of a chance. Cheerful, isn't it? Still, at least there's guys like Cid to provide occasional moments of brevity. Oh, and talking of which, why don't we grab our captain for our first little bit of character analysis. Cid has been many things throughout the history of the Final Fantasy games. A knight, an engineer, a headmaster. Funnily enough, the majority of Cids are all somewhat associated with engineering, even with airships specifically. And that's certainly true of this, the most famous Cid of all. Of all the characters in FF7, Cid is perhaps the one that's universally liked. Because, well, he's your typical badass. His introduction alone is spectacular, and his actual design is awesome. The goggles, the ever-present cigarette, and the spear. It's actually perhaps the most old-school design of all FF7's characters. Cid's whole look is a throwback to the Dragoon class of early Final Fantasy games. He also happens to get a whole bunch of the game's funniest lines. There is a sense, especially after the personal stories we've had and the extreme depression of Nibelheim, that the plot of FF7 is becoming a lot more introverted and withdrawn. So at this point it comes as quite a shock when we bump into Cid, as loud and gregarious a personality as you'll find. Still, there is a bit more to Cid than being a random badass line generator and saying, "Glad to be aboard, numbskulls!" Oddly enough, I don't think we're meant to fully like him a lot of the time. For all his badassery, he certainly does have a nasty streak, and it definitely gets shown off from time to time, especially with Shira, his, well, assistant basically. Cid kind of takes all his frustrations at being stuck in Rocket Town out on Shira due to the failure of the rocket launch, resulting in an incredibly abusive relationship, and Shira herself almost seems to be a victim of Stockholm Syndrome. It's a very controversial, weird relationship to have for someone who's supposed to be one of the heroes. It's perhaps not spoiling too much to say that there is a curve here, and there's a big moment where Cid does finally mellow out when it comes to Shira. But at the start, yeah, some of the other characters seem to get it right, because they do actively question the relationship and actually ask why Cid is being such a dick. It's a weird moment in the game because, well, it's an issue that most games wouldn't even touch with a 10-foot barge pole, and I don't know how well FF7 handles it, to be honest. It always gave me mixed feelings about Cid, but then maybe that was the intention all along. I mean, there are positive sides to the character aside from his badassery. He's generally, quite funny, and at a certain point in Disc 2 he doesn't mind taking on the role of the leader. But then you get this relationship, so it's a mixed bag and makes the character perhaps a bit more interesting than it would be if, he just said numbskulls and that. Anyway, the passivity of Shira in the relationship isn't exactly nice to see either, but then, what do you expect? It's a depressing game. It's still a depressing game and always will be. Let's just move on. Let's delve a little bit more into thematics, shall we? Previously we looked at FF7's environmental bent, but one other thing that I always enjoyed about FF7 was how it deals with the most traditional RPG mechanics and cliches, and actually bothers to construct detailed explanations for all of them that don't just feel shoehorned in. Ever since the dawning of the RPG, there's some things you just accept. You know that there's going to be a bunch of monsters milling about the world, and you know that apparently normal looking people are going to be capable of crazy things, such as casting magic and whatnot. Usually monsters are thought of as, at best, possessed souls. Once upon a time they might have been normal, but now they're just an abomination. And unless they end up just being henchmen, not much explanation goes into them aside from that. FF7 is firmly on the possessed soul side to boot, but offers a little bit more grounding. It's still fantastical, but it explores the situation a little bit more, saying that the reason for the existence of monsters is due, in part, to the polluted nature of the world. Shinra's scientific experiments and refining of Mako has created a severe imbalance, and this is how the planet has reacted to that. But there's perhaps an even larger cause at play. Now this is going a little into Disc 2 analysis, but we'll roll with it still. It's pretty clear once you get further and further north that the world in FF7 is recovering from an incredibly severe crisis that almost destroyed the planet, and we're still not all that far into the recovery process. Because after all, a lot of that boils down to Jenova and what it did to the planet. It's implied, although not said outright, that Jenova, as opposed to flat out killing the ancients, actually turned most of them into monsters, the abominations we see day in and day out. It even provides multiple reasons for the possible existence of all these creatures. The use of magic also ties in with the game's themes. It's explained that magic comes from materia, rocks of solidified lifestream that can be used by people. Lifestream is of course the blood of the planet, so when you cast that bolt free or whatever, you're using, well, not even 1/1000th of the planet's resources to do something like that. So this justifies the amount of damage that something like Meteor could do. Magic is that central to the game's plot and how it all wraps up in the end. It's not just a mechanic, it's a case where a mechanic becomes the entire cornerstone of the game's story. As we go on, we'll see another deconstruction of the RPG cliche, that of the regular grunt, but to go into that would be seriously spoiling things for the time being. Even something like the disconnection between cities can be explained, almost, by what the Shinra do. We're so used, especially in older RPGs like this one, to seeing no pathways at all between cities and the like. But think back to Midgar. Did you even see that many roads there connecting the sectors? It's clear that the Shinra, at some point, became purely concerned with the production of Mako and absolutely nothing else. They let cities fall into disrepute because they knew what made the most money and saw no reason to plunge their resources into anything else. So with that in mind, do you really expect to see a proper transport system? Again, it provides a neat explanation for a well-worn cliché and drives home just how dystopic FF7's world is. It almost doesn't seem so from the outset, but as you travel it's clear just how broken everything is. It's a world where something terrible has happened, and it hasn't even found its feet again yet, thus allowing the Shinra to step in and take advantage. Huge themes like that are certainly a part of FF7, but another important part of the game for me is its personal edge. Despite being one of the biggest games ever made, FF7 is an intensely personal work, not something you usually see all that much of in games, especially not at this level, and a lot of that personal stuff is about loss. It's a somewhat well-known fact that during the production of FF7, Hironobu Sakaguchi, the creator of the series, lost his mother. And that seems to inform a lot of the characters' backgrounds, if you think about it. Of those whom we know about who have parents, we know that Cloud's mother and Tifa's father died at Nibelheim. Later we find out that Tifa's mother is also dead. Iris's real mother and father are both dead. Red 13's mother and father are dead too, and he always thought of his father as a coward. Both Iris and Red also think of themselves as the last of their race, they don't have anyone else to turn to. We don't know about Barrett's parents, but we know that he is a guardian to Marlene, who also lost her biological parents, as Elmira is a guardian to Iris. And then, of course, there's Sephiroth. It's hard to tell which of Jenova and the completely unknown Lucretia is the biological parent or the guardian. Maybe it's both. In the case of someone like Cloud in particular, I wonder if FF7 is, at heart, a game about the loss of parental guidance, of losing that early on in your life and not being ready of it, of having to make those steps forward in dealing with life after your mother or father have gone. I wonder. And as far as death itself goes, it's also known that Iris's death was planned very early on in the game's development. Yoshinori Kitase explains the motivations behind the scene best. Death comes suddenly and there is no notion of good or bad attached to it. It leaves, not a dramatic feeling, but a great emptiness. When you lose someone you loved very much, you feel this big empty space and think, if I had known this was coming, I would have done things differently. These are the feelings I wanted to arouse in the players with Aeris' death relatively early in the game. If I had known this was coming, I would have done things differently. Now I wonder how this phrase applies to the players of FF7, because one thing I always note when seeing or participating in discussions on Aeris' death is how much people actually used Aeris as a character before her death, and how that affects the scene. If they didn't use her, whether they knew about the scene or not, they tend to be less affected by it. And if, like me, you use Aeris constantly, you've built up that relationship between yourself and the character, and it becomes affecting, not just through story but through gameplay. One other point though, for those who've played through FF7 multiple times, say you didn't use Aeris on the first playthrough, would you then use her on the second, or vice versa? Would you make the most of her while she's around? I mean, because the odd thing about a game is that, in a sense, you can see it coming, and you can do things differently, depending on the story obviously. As we get into Disc 2, we'll also be struggling with the loss of identity in quite a big way. However, we've certainly had hints before then. One thing I noticed how often Cloud reaffirms his identity to everybody. How often does he say something along the lines of, "I'm Cloud, formerly of Soldier, born in Nibelheim"? He says it so much it becomes quite noticeable. These are the things he knows about himself that he holds true. And yet there are so many gaps. And then, when Sephiroth takes control of him, we understand. Cloud's identity is, well, pretty weak to say the least. It's surprising just how little we know about a lot of our main characters. Cloud is our main hero, and we know virtually nothing aside from what little information he can piece together inside his head. Tifa is kind of similar in that she's so clearly hiding something, a secret so huge that she knows will tear the group apart. It's all rather worrying, putting it mildly. And it's one of the moments where the game really does sink those claws in. If Cloud, the main hero, the person we've been relying on all this time, is this broken, then well, what chance have we got? Did we ever have a chance at all, in fact? As we get into Disc 2, we're going to be dealing with this a hell of a lot more, and we'll also have a little bit more on it later. For now though, let's relax with one of the game's lighter characters, as well as one of my least favourite to boot. Yeah, Cait Sith. He's an odd duck. He's not exactly a favourite for a lot of people, and I would probably consider him my second least favourite of all the characters, leaving out one we haven't really mentioned much yet. He's, well, a bit of an arse. Think about it. The guy just joins your party without even asking permission, turns out to be a spy, tries to redeem himself somewhat by sacrificing his body for the good of the planet, and then comes back at basically the most inopportune time ever. Oh, and also he kidnaps Marlene. I mean, that's basically what we know so far. He's such an odd character when it comes to battles too. He's good with magic and has a ton of health, but he's pretty weak physically without having those godlike Aeris limits. Hell, his limits are the weirdest of the lot. He has one where he does a random amount of damage with some dice, and the other is a slot machine that can do just about anything, including kill your entire party in one bloody hit. It's hard to think of much of a use for Cait Sith, and because of that, frankly, I barely use him. Still, he does have a character arc, of sorts. He starts out as the jokey character, then kinda turns evil, and then later on in Disc 2, he becomes a wee bit more useful to our quest. Of course, we know that he's a Shinra spy, but the question is, well, who? It's kind of easy to figure it out actually, although the game's never explicit with it. Cait Sith is Reeve, the one member of Shinra's big board who always seemed to disagree with President Shinra's latest plan to, I don't know, destroy an entire city in order to get back at Avalanche. This sort of moral compass, if you will, at least points the finger towards him anyway. He also manages to save the group from a few tough scrapes and gives us plenty of information about what the Shinra are getting up to, which does at least redeem him somewhat. Still, I gotta say, I virtually never use him. If I have the services of a Super X soldier, a badass pilot, and a bloodthirsty Wutai princess, all of whom usually deal 9999 damage at all times by game's end, I don't tend to have much use for a cat on a giant doll. There's a reason why Cait Sith tends to just get called cat shit. Hell, it wouldn't surprise me if Cait Sith was just a mistranslation. Speaking of translation, let's have a look at FF7's script, shall we? It's kind of an odd duck, as the writing's not really of the sort that you usually find in games. The writers of FF7 had a distinct approach in mind, that being of extreme realism. Believe it or not, they wanted the dialogue to sound as natural as possible and for it to have a certain grittiness about it. To some extent, this is why, weirdly for a game made in 1997, Final Fantasy VII is littered with swear words. I imagine this was the first time that a lot of gamers had ever seen the word shit inside a game. Certainly was for me. But from a pure dialogue writing perspective, it means that there's a lot of beats, a lot of stumbling over words, a lot of dropping certain letters, and it's not just like a Barrett thing or whatever. All the characters have their more unique voices. A lot of the more get up and go characters like Cloud and Cid, for example, do you notice they always seem to drop their G's? It's hardly consistent for reasons we'll get into soon enough, but it does add a nice touch when it comes to making the dialogue sound good in your head. It certainly sounds a lot better there than it would do if it were voiced by some disinterested actor and directed by someone who didn't have the first-hand clue about that sort of thing. The extreme realism approach is also where you get quite a lot of animations, nods of the head and largely wordless sequences, such as Iris's death of course, or Elmira's flashback. It's here where the writing really shines, simply because the writers recognise that sometimes words don't even need to be said. So considering the generally low standard of writing stories and scripts in games, particularly around this time seeing as it was such a new thing, Final Fantasy VII really does shine in parts. It's a shame then that the translation, alas, barely does it any justice. There are some rather famous moments here of course, I mean who could possibly forget this guy are sick? But sometimes the translation is such that sequences just don't make any sense at all. You get dialogue that appears to be assigned to the one character, or, well, is just garbled shit. Lines that have completely had any meaning ripped out of them. Now, this is a nigh on 60-hour RPG, so they can't all be killers, and this was around the time when people were still coming to grips with actually bothering to do any kind of decent translation job at all. Not every company was like Working Designs or whatever, and if Final Fantasy VII feels like it was translated by a group of people who probably lied about being bilingual on their CV, but in truth were sweating over a well-thumbed Japanese to English dictionary the whole time, well, that's probably because it was, and it's not like it was a massive priority for games back then. Japanese to English translation is a very hard task that doesn't usually get much time and resources devoted to it, and so you kind of have to pick through the dialogue with a fine-tooth comb to see the parts where it actually does shine through the sadly botched translation job. There is a definite vision there that's very much unlike the majority of games ever released, but it tends to get fogged up quite a lot of the time. Right, for our next bout of character analysis, let's have a look at the family dog. Red 13, Nanaki, whatever you want to call him. He has a rather odd progression in that he starts out really quite annoying, but then gets quite a bit better as time goes along. Seriously, the first time he comes in, he's all pseudy and the like, purposefully mysterious and too good for any of this shit, and frankly you just want to slap the bastard. Okay, that's probably a bit much, but it's not all that endearing. He also has the odd distinction of being both the oldest in the group, 48, and the youngest too, seeing as his age is apparently only equivalent to about 16 in human years. He's a lot better by the time he gets to Cosmo Canyon, as he at least feels like a supporting character who's been, if not pulled into our story, but almost taken in by it. At first he doesn't want to do much other than hitch a ride, but the calm flashback draws him in. His own story, of the ones we get for supporting characters in Disc 1, is certainly a fair bit more interesting than Barrett's, even if it is just a simple coming-of-age story. One of the things I do generally like about the character is his constant worry that he might become a monster. He certainly sticks out amongst a group that largely consists of humans, hell even our stuffed toy cat is controlled by one. He's different though, and he could have easily been someone who we'd end up fighting against, especially if Hojo had been able to experiment on him for any length of time. As the Genova cells become ever more important to the plot, it becomes a bit more of a worry, and although he doesn't have a particularly big character arc, the thought that things could have been so different humbles him as he gets closer to the group. Still, he is mainly prized for what he offers in combat. He's a pretty strong character, and he usually spends quite a bit of time in my party early on, at least until Cid comes in. He gets a grotesquely overpowered weapon after Cosmo Canyon, and if you upgrade his strength with that, yeah, you ain't gonna have much trouble when it comes to fights. He ends up being a capable enough all-rounder, basically. He's fairly average story-wise, but not a bad character. Okay, last of all we'll revisit two characters we've already looked at. It's certainly something to see how Cloud has progressed since Midgar, because well, things have gotten a whole lot more complex. It's obviously pretty common for characters to get a bit of self-doubt going. Hell, damn near every character in this game has some at one point or another, but this is more than self-doubt, it's like self-erasure. It's quite shocking when it happens and you finally realise that Sephiroth has some sort of control over Cloud and that he might not exactly be the person he's always said he was. It's kind of a worry too, as throughout Disc 1 you've come to rely on Cloud just about every step of the way. You can't really exaggerate just how useful Cloud is, particularly in combat. He's the absolute best character. He isn't just an all-rounder, he's a master of all trades and a jack of none. The best attacks, the best magic, the best everything. But then you can't really trust him anymore, and you wonder just where he's been leading us to all this time. It's quite the move. If there's one thing you can usually count on in a game, it's that you're going to be able to trust your main character. They're always going to be doing the right thing. And then FF7 goes ahead and introduces a bit of unreliability into the mix. They don't just give Cloud faults, they tear everything you thought you'd figured out about the character to pieces. And so the emo accusations all start up again, perhaps with a little bit more bite behind them this time. This characterisation was certainly quite a bit influential, and gave way to many a hero that was filled with similar doubts, who didn't really know what they were doing, who felt like they were living a lie. But that's not so much Cloud's fault really. The relationships change more as you realise the fragility of our group, how everyone, especially Tifa and Iris, were trying to hold Cloud together. Tifa's worry when Zack gets mentioned in Gongaga is clearly connected to previous events. It's as if she doesn't want Cloud to actually think about anything, because there's a danger that if he does, the whole edifice might crumble. And this certainly becomes a lot more explicit when we get into Disc 2. Needless to say, things are going to get a whole lot worse for Cloud before we're done. And then there's Iris, who we also have to look at closely now, as her arc comes to an end. Back in Midgar, she was largely a bit of a damsel in distress, albeit one with some rather fun traits that made her appealing. And of course, she's a boss in combat. You'll notice that Iris was basically in my party for the whole of the disc. It's not just because I like the character, it's because she pretty much kicks ass if you take the time to use her and up her limits. With Iris, your party is basically close to immortal. Indeed, 2 of her limits make the party literally immortal. And this fits in with Iris's character because, in the end, she was the one who was holding the group together most of all. As the last of the Ancients, she knew that she had quite a large responsibility. She also knew that despite all of the battles and whatnot, she was probably going to be the person who'd be best placed to save the planet. Iris stops being a damsel and becomes kind of like the group's mother figure. Not in an ethereal kind of sense, as she certainly dishes out a bit of tough love every once in a while, but in the sense that she becomes the group's guide, leading them ever closer to the temple and ultimately the Forgotten Capital. When you think about it, she was the only person who truly had a plan for dealing with Sephiroth. The rest of them wanted to chase Sephiroth, and we had the Black Materia for a few seconds, but even if Cloud hadn't been controlled by Sephiroth, what were we actually going to do with it? Did we know? Would we just hold on to it forever? Everyone else was making things up on the fly, but Iris had a plan. Alas, it was cut short. When Iris dies, the party basically goes to shit. It's chaotic from here on out because she was the one who really held things together and was able to, in particular, manage Cloud effectively. You're greeted with such a massive gap after her death because that's what it's supposed to feel like. The group's now totally without guidance. But for all this, she never really attains any special powers or anything like that. She's still very much, character-wise, the normal girl. And that's what I've always liked about Iris, and why she's my favourite character in the game. The EU and the fans do tend to lionise her quite a lot, turning her into a waif-like figure with the weight of the planet on her shoulders, or saying that she's this crazy awesome girl who you could picture yourself marrying. But in the end, she's really just quite normal. She's responsible and caring, but she likes a laugh and knows how to have fun. She feels quite naturally written, despite the botched translation. And you know, you just don't see all that many characters like her in games. Everyone's so special, big and fantastical. And hell, Iris is in a way. But as far as personality goes, she's actually quite relatable. You can recognise her. And that deserves quite a lot of praise, really. Anyway, that's the end of another bout of analysis. Finally, we're going to move on to Disc 2. And you'd best prepare yourself because the plot's going to come at you thick and fast. Shit is most certainly going to be hitting the fan on a grand scale, so watch out. Of course, what we're going to do? We're going to continue heading north. But until then, it's time to end this video. Thanks for watching, and whoever you are, whoever you be, have a good one, take care, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.